The wind whispered low across the high plains, tugging at the brittle tufts of grass that clung to the dry earth like stubborn memories. The Granger Ranch sat half a mile from the old riverbed, now just a scar of dust and forgotten floods. The house, once painted white, now faded to a tired gray, stood against the sky like an aging sentinel. Its shutters creaked when the breeze caught them just right, and the porch steps sagged beneath every bootstep. Inside, Thomas Granger moved with slow, deliberate rhythm. He folded his shirt sleeves up to his elbows and dunked a hand-rolled cigarette into a coffee mug left from yesterday's breakfast. The habit wasn't about the taste anymore. It was something to do with his hands, while the silence settled over him like a second skin. The house had been quieter than it ought to be for over a decade now. Since Claire passed, the rooms held a cold kind of emptiness, like winter had taken root somewhere inside the walls. Her sewing basket still sat beneath the parlor window, untouched. Her favorite shawl, cream-colored with little blue flowers, hung over the back of the rocking chair. He'd never had the heart to move it. The days bled into one another with the sameness of old routines. Saddle the mare, mend a fence, check the water troughs, feed the chickens, count the cattle, bury the chicken the fox got, fix the gate the wind ripped open. And once a month, like clockwork, he'd make the ride into Whitetail Junction for supplies: coffee, flour, horseshoes, nails, tobacco, and sometimes a bottle of whiskey he pretended he didn't need. That morning, the sun barely lifted above the ridge when Thomas loaded his saddlebags. He paused at the barn door, squinting into the dawn, his hand resting on the neck of his old bay mare, Esther. Her ears flicked at the sound of his breath. "Don't give me that look," he muttered, pulling the cinch tighter. "Town don't bite worse than the winters out here." Esther snorted like she didn't believe him. The ride into town took just under 2 hours. The dirt road was flanked by scrub brush and distant buttes, and the horizon shimmered with the promise of heat. As he approached the main road, Thomas saw the town rise out of the dust like a memory: wooden storefronts, a half-built church steeple, and the windmill turning lazy circles above the blacksmith's roof. Whitetail Junction had changed little over the years. The people, maybe a few new faces behind counters, but the tone hadn't softened. Folks were always too curious, too loud when they should be quiet, and too quiet when justice ought to speak up. Thomas hitched Esther outside the general store and stepped inside. The bell above the door let out a tired ring. "Morning, Granger," said Bill Cotter, the shopkeeper, wiping his hands on a rag. "Back for your usual?" Thomas gave a small nod and headed for the back where the flour sacks waited. He was halfway through packing his things when the sound of raised voices filtered in from the street. A few men had gathered near the auction yard, their laughter brittle, uneasy. A wagon sat parked near the platform, guarded by 2 mounted deputies. Then he heard it. Chains. Thomas paused, frowning. Marshal Deeks sat atop his gray stallion, scanning the crowd like a bored schoolmaster. His mustache was thick and oiled, his badge gleaming like it had something to prove. In the wagon were 5 figures, all bound at the wrists, covered in dust and bruises. Most looked like stragglers, men caught stealing or riding where they shouldn't have. But one figure stood out. A young woman, no more than 20, stood barefoot on the wooden planks of the auction platform. Her long black hair was braided, her posture tall despite the shackles at her wrists. Her eyes, dark, sharp, unflinching, scanned the crowd with something between contempt and cold resignation. "Step right up," the auctioneer barked. "Territory law allows indentured service for unclaimed prisoners. This one, here's a squaw from the White Bone Tribe. Last of her kind, they say. Strong, healthy, no known diseases. Make a fine houseworker or field hand." The crowd murmured. Some sneered. A few men whistled. "She got a name?" someone called. The marshal answered flatly. "Name's Nayeli." Thomas felt his jaw tighten. He stepped closer, the midday heat pressing against his shoulders. The girl, no, woman, remained still as stone, her lips pressed tight. The auctioneer laughed. $10 to start. Who will open?" Silence. "Ah, come now. $5? Nothing but the buzz of flies. 3. Thomas looked at her, looked at the crowd, looked at the damn marshal and the glint in his eyes. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a leather coin pouch. 5. The word left his mouth before he'd finished counting. The crowd turned. The auctioneer blinked. 5. Sold. Nayeli didn't flinch. She didn't move when the chains were unlocked, didn't speak when the deputy handed her over to Thomas with a look of disgust. "You sure about this, Granger?" the marshal asked, voice low. "Ain't no tellin' what kind of trouble she brings." Thomas said nothing. He held out his hand to Nayeli, not to take her wrist, but to help her down. She hesitated, then stepped off the platform without touching him. They walked through the parting crowd. Whispers trailed behind them like flies on meat. "Old fool. Bet she'll gut him in his sleep. Must be lonely out on that ranch." Thomas ignored every voice. At the hitching post, he helped Nayeli onto Esther's back, then climbed up behind her. He kept a respectful distance, holding the reins. As they rode out of town, the sun hung low and gold in the west, casting their shadows long across the prairie. Neither of them spoke. The silence was heavy, but not empty. They passed dry riverbeds and sun-bleached rocks. A hawk circled overhead. Thomas cleared his throat once. "I'll show you the house. You'll have your own room." She didn't respond, just looked ahead, the wind catching the ends of her braid. They reached the ranch just as the last of the daylight faded. The house stood silent, its windows catching the glow of dusk. Thomas dismounted and tied up Esther. He looked up at Nayeli, still seated. "You hungry?" Still no answer. He stepped back and motioned. "You're free to eat or not, free to leave if you want. I ain't keeping you." She looked down at him for a long, unreadable moment, then slid off the horse and followed him inside. Thomas opened the door. The air inside was still and cool. "I'll make a fire," he muttered, striking a match against the hearthstone. The flames caught slowly, flickering against the walls. He pulled 2 tin plates from the shelf, sliced bread, cheese, and jerky, and set them down at the table. Nayeli sat across from him, not touching the food. Her eyes never left his. "I ain't gonna hurt you," he said simply. "Ain't gonna ask you to work. Just don't want to see someone treated like a damn mule." Finally, she spoke, her voice dry and quiet. "Why me?" Thomas looked into the fire. "Because no one else did." They sat in silence again. Then Nayeli reached for the bread, slow and deliberate. She chewed without expression, but the tension in her shoulders softened by a thread. After they ate, Thomas showed her to the guest room. It still smelled faintly of cedar and dust. "You can lock the door if you want, or not. Ain't none of my business." Nayeli stood in the doorway for a long moment, then stepped inside without a word. Thomas returned to the main room, poured a small glass of whiskey, and stared into the fire until it burned down to ash. Outside, the wind shifted. A coyote howled in the distance. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But for the first time in a long while, the ranch didn't feel quite so empty. And somewhere behind a closed door, a woman who had every reason to run had chosen to stay. The morning light filtered through the warped window pane, casting slanted shadows across the dusty floorboards. A rooster crowed somewhere out behind the barn, followed by the restless lowing of cattle stirring in the field beyond. Thomas Granger stood at the sink, pouring water from the hand pump into a dented tin basin, steam rising as it met the stove-warmed kettle. His hands moved slowly, as if reluctant to break the fragile stillness that hung over the house. Behind him, the door to the guest room remained closed. He hadn't slept well. The whiskey hadn't helped. He'd stared at the ceiling most of the night, mind grinding through thoughts he couldn't quite give shape to. He hadn't meant to speak up at the auction. He hadn't ridden into town with anything on his mind but coffee and horseshoes. But something in him had twisted when he saw her standing there, proud, barefoot, and shackled like an animal. Maybe it was her silence. Maybe it was the look in her eyes that said she expected nothing from anyone. Maybe he saw a part of himself in her, the part that kept living even after it seemed there wasn't much left to live for. The door creaked open behind him. He didn't turn. Naeli stepped into the kitchen barefoot, arms folded tight across her chest, her long braid over one shoulder. She didn't speak, didn't ask permission. She simply stood there, watching him pour water into a second basin. "There's biscuits," Thomas said quietly. "Still warm, if you don't mind them, a little black on the bottom." Naeli moved to the table, picked one up, and took a bite. Her expression didn't change, but she didn't spit it out either. She ate slowly, as if measuring each chew. "I'll be out back," Thomas said, drying his hands. "Chickens'll need tending. You don't owe me nothing. Just, if you want to look around, feel free." She didn't answer, but when he glanced back as he stepped out the door, she was still standing there, her eyes not on him but on the field beyond the window, where the land rolled out in wide golden silence. The morning passed without words. Thomas worked the coop, hauled feed, and mended a broken post on the front corral. Every so often he caught sight of her in the corner of his vision, walking the perimeter of the house, peering cautiously into the barn, standing beneath the cottonwood tree with her head tilted toward the wind. She moved with the kind of stillness that came from years of watching before acting, of listening harder than most people knew how. By midday the sun had risen high and hot, and the distant hills shimmered with heat. Thomas pulled his hat low and leaned against the fence, drinking from a canteen. He heard footsteps approach, soft, barefoot again. "You fence with no rails," Naeli said. He looked at her, surprised to hear her voice. She pointed toward the western edge of the pasture, where a line of posts stood empty, as if waiting for rails that never came. "I ran short on lumber," he said, wiping sweat from his brow. "Planned to finish it last spring. Things got in the way." She didn't respond, only stared at the unfinished fence with a slight narrowing of her eyes. "You used to mend things?" he asked. "Back where you come from?" She looked at him then. "I built traps, fixed bows, made shelters, but not fences." He nodded. "Close enough." She glanced toward the barn. "You have tools?" "In the shed," he said, "but I wasn't asking." "I didn't ask if you were," she replied, and walked off in the direction of the shed. Thomas chuckled quietly to himself. She was sharper than the rest gave her credit for. Maybe sharper than he was. The rest of the day slipped by in a rhythm he hadn't felt in years. By late afternoon, Naeli had pulled the sled from behind the barn and was dragging dry branches and cut timber toward the western fence line. She moved efficiently, tying rails together with thick hemp cord. He joined her, handing her nails, lining up beams. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. When the sun dipped toward the horizon and the sky turned lavender and rose, the last of the rails were in place. The fence stood, simple, sturdy, complete. They stood together, looking out over the field where the cattle grazed in silence. "You work fast," he said. She nodded once. "Better to finish what you start." He glanced sideways at her. "You planning to stay then?" Her eyes didn't waver. For now, it was more than he expected. More than he'd hoped for. That night, they ate together at the small wooden table. He'd cooked stew, salt pork, potatoes, onions from the root cellar. She ate with quiet dignity, her hands moving precisely, never wasting emotion. He watched her in the firelight, the way her features softened when she was thinking, the small scar near her eyebrow, the way she held her spoon like it was a weapon that could be useful if needed. "Where'd you learn to cook like this?" she asked suddenly. He blinked. "My wife taught me. Claire. Long time ago." She set her spoon down. "You loved her." He nodded, swallowing hard. "Still do?" Naeli looked into the fire. "My mother was strong. She didn't smile much, but she sang. When my father died, she buried him with a knife and a prayer. She said a man should leave the world armed and remembered." Thomas stared into the flames. "Sounds like she had more sense than most." Naeli's voice dropped to a whisper. "The soldiers burned everything, took what they wanted, left the rest to rot." He said nothing, afraid anything he said might sound like an excuse for the kind of things that couldn't be excused. "I don't expect anything here," she said. "Not safety. Not kindness." He looked at her then. "I can't give you back what you lost. I can't make the world different, but I can give you a roof and a say in things. And no one here will ever touch you without your word." She nodded once, slow. "That's more than most." The wind rose outside, rustling the grasses. The fire popped softly. A sense of quiet settled between them, deeper than silence. An understanding. The next morning began earlier. Nayeli rose before dawn, already gathering eggs from the coop when Thomas stepped outside with his coffee. "You don't need to," he said. "I want to," she answered. And that was that. Over the following days, a pattern emerged, unspoken but sure. She cooked breakfast while he chopped wood. They rode the fence lines together, repairing wire, checking for predators. She began carving small wooden shapes in her spare time. Birds, deer, a fox, with tiny eyes made from ash. He found them on windowsills, fence posts, and once on the saddle horn of his old trail horse. Her way of speaking without words. One evening, a storm rolled in. They sat on the porch together as the clouds swelled and cracked with lightning. Rain battered the land, hard and cleansing. Thomas passed her a blanket. "My people say storms wash away the dead things," she said. He looked out at the rain. "Plenty of those out here." When the storm passed, the air smelled of sage and earth. She stood to go inside, but paused at the door. "Thank you," she said. He didn't ask what for. He just nodded, tipping his hat as he rose behind her. That night, she left her door open a crack. Not enough to invite, but enough to trust. He stared at the ceiling again, hands folded behind his head. For the first time in over 10 years, he didn't feel alone. Not really. Not anymore. The days grew longer, with the sun rising earlier each morning, the sky brushing its colors across the open prairie like a painter rediscovering joy. The chill of winter had begun to slip from the land, replaced by the slow burn of spring creeping into the soil. Grasses grew a little taller. The cattle wandered further. Birds sang louder than they had the month before. Thomas Granger noticed the change not just in the land but in the house, in the spaces that had once been hollow. The floorboards still creaked the same way, the kettle still took too long to boil, and the wind still rattled the shutters at night. But there was a difference now. The silence no longer rang so loud, and when he sat down at the table in the morning, there were 2 plates instead of 1. There was always movement in the air, Nayeli at the stove, or moving past the open windows with her braid swinging behind her as she checked the herbs she'd planted near the garden fence. He'd found himself watching her without realizing it, hands idle while a hammer or brush sat still in his grip. There was a calm in the way she worked, like every motion served a purpose. She never rushed, never wasted time. But she also never asked for approval. She did what she wanted to do. And he found, more and more, he wanted to watch her do it. One morning, after fixing a loose wheel on the wagon, Thomas found her under the cottonwood tree, with a young calf lying beside her. She had one hand on its neck, whispering something too soft to hear, while her other hand mixed something in a shallow bowl. When he approached, she didn't turn to him. "Snake bite," she said simply. "It's swelling fast. If I can keep the fever down, it'll live. You want help? You can bring the yellow root from the shed. Top shelf, in the tin with the red string." He nodded, already turning back toward the barn. She didn't explain how she knew which herb would help or how much to use. She didn't need to. She just knew. The calf lived. And that night, Thomas said grace over dinner for the first time in years. He didn't say it out loud, but he did it just the same. And she must have sensed it, because after dinner, she placed a small wooden carving next to his seat at the table. A calf, curled up asleep, its tiny eyes carved with the same stillness she always carried in her hands. That night, they sat together on the porch. The moon was fat and low on the horizon, casting silver light across the dry earth. Crickets chirped in the tall grass. A coyote called once, then vanished into the black hills. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked. She didn't answer right away. "Where would I go?" "Anywhere," he said. You could take the wagon. You've earned that. More than. She looked down at her hands. There's no tribe to return to, no family. My people were scattered like ash. Some fled to Mexico, some were taken, some just disappeared. He sat quietly, not knowing what to say. I stay because here, I'm not hunted, she continued. Not yet, anyway. He turned toward her. You're safe here. That's not a maybe. She looked at him, her eyes darker than the sky. You say that, like the world agrees. He couldn't argue with her. He'd seen the way the townsfolk looked at her, the way they looked at him too now. You remember that boy at Cotter's store last week? She asked suddenly. He did. A lanky, red-haired teen who'd refused to take her money at the counter until Thomas stepped in. He spit at the ground after we left, she said. Not at you, at me. Thomas clenched his jaw. I should have said something. No, you shouldn't have. Not there, not with folks like him watching. You afraid? He asked. She shook her head. I'm tired of being reminded. A long pause passed between them. I used to think I was done, Thomas said, his voice low. Done feeling anything that wasn't dust or ache. But you make this place feel alive again. She turned her head toward him. You feel alive because someone else is here? He shook his head. I feel alive because you don't ask me to be someone I'm not. You let me be quiet. And you don't fill up the quiet with noise. Nayeli smiled faintly, just enough to crease the corners of her eyes. You're still talking, though. He chuckled. Maybe that's your fault. They sat in the quiet again, but it wasn't empty. It was warm, steady, like coals in a hearth. Then one afternoon, as they returned from mending a broken fence near the creek bed, they found a rider waiting by the barn. A tall man on a gray horse, clean-shaven, wearing a deputy's star and a polished belt buckle. His eyes were sharp, his stance too upright. He tapped the saddle horn with his gloved hand. Thomas dismounted slowly, his gaze cautious. Help you? The rider tipped his hat. Deputy Eli Carrington, out of Fort Mercer. Thomas nodded. Granger. Carrington's eyes drifted to Nayeli, who was already untying the saddle from her horse. Your keeper? He asked. Thomas stepped closer, slow and deliberate. She's free. She was taken in by Marshal Deeks a few months ago. Last of the White Bone rebels. You were at the auction. Thomas didn't blink. And I bought her freedom. $5, fair and square. Carrington nodded, but his expression didn't ease. There's word out east. Some say that auction wasn't legal. Say it was a cover for smuggling. She ain't no smuggled goods, Thomas growled. She's a person, and she's not going anywhere. I ain't here to drag anyone off today, Carrington said calmly. Just doing my job. Asking questions. You'd be wise to keep her away from town for a while. Some men are stirring things up, talking law, talking vigilante justice. Thomas stared him down. She's got every right to live free. I don't make the laws, Mr. Granger. I just try to keep folks from bleeding out on both sides of them. Carrington tipped his hat again and rode off without another word. That night, Thomas sat with a loaded rifle across his knees. He didn't say anything when Nayeli brought him a bowl of stew. He just nodded and kept watching the dark. I can leave, she said. He looked at her. No, you can't. Why not? Because I need you here. That was the first time he said it out loud. She sat beside him, her knees brushing his, and they ate together with the fire crackling at their feet. Later, as the fire died down, she reached for his hand. Just for a moment, just long enough for the silence between them to change shape. When the wind passed through the grass that night, it carried the faintest sound of two souls no longer lost. And in the distance, beyond the edge of the lantern light, the world watched and waited. But for now, for this moment, they were safe. A red haze settled over the plains in the hour before sundown, and the sky burned with streaks of orange and bruised violet. The wind was still that evening, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Thomas sat at the edge of the porch, oiling the lever of his Winchester with careful, deliberate strokes. Beside him, the old dog he'd rescued years ago from the trading post lay asleep, ears twitching at the occasional insect buzz. Nayeli was out back, tending the herb garden, her silhouette cutting a clean figure against the slanted light. She had planted rosemary, sage, lavender, and a few native roots Thomas couldn't name but recognized now by scent and purpose. She moved between them like someone protecting something fragile. He liked watching her like that. She didn't know, but sometimes he stood just beyond the barn, pretending to clean tools while his eyes followed her. He wondered if she'd ever known peace before the ranch. If she could find it here now. The news Deputy Carrington brought days ago still sat heavy in Thomas's chest. Something unspoken had shifted. The air felt tighter. Every time a rider came into view on the far hills, his shoulders stiffened. And each night, he loaded the same 2 shells into the rifle before resting it beside the door. He had lived too long to be paranoid without reason. The world had a way of knocking when a man least wanted company. He set the rifle aside and stood. The porch boards groaned under his boots. Nayeli looked up from the garden as he approached, wiping her hands on the hem of her faded skirt. "We should talk," he said. She nodded once, following him back to the porch. Inside, the lantern was already lit. The glow warmed the corners of the room, throwing their shadows up the wall as they sat across from one another at the table. "Carrington might not come back," Thomas said, "but if he does, he won't be alone next time." Nayeli's face didn't change. "You think they'll try to take me?" He paused. "I don't know what they'll try. That's what worries me." She reached for the carving knife on the table, the one she used for woodwork, and began slicing a thin strip from a fresh block of cedar. "I don't want you hurt over me." He leaned forward. "I don't want you gone because of me." She looked at him then, her gaze steady, calm. "I chose to stay. I still do." He nodded, his throat tight. "Then we make a plan." They spent the next hour preparing. Nayeli packed a small satchel with medicine and dried food. Thomas checked the trap door in the floorboards of the barn, hidden beneath a loose hay pallet where an old root cellar sat unused. It wouldn't stop anyone determined, but it might buy them time. Just in case, they reinforced the windows, moved supplies close to the back door, and made sure the horses were saddled before night fell. It wasn't panic. It was quiet urgency. The kind of readiness born not of fear but of respect for what the world could do when it decided not to care. When the moon climbed high and the night settled thick, they sat beside the hearth again. This time she reached for his hand without hesitation. He closed his fingers around hers. Neither of them spoke. The next 2 days passed in a haze of motion. Thomas rode into town under the pretense of needing flour, but really he wanted to feel the weight of things. He noticed the stairs were longer now, the conversations quieter when he passed. At Cotter's store, no one said a word until he reached the counter. "You seen the flyers?" Cotter asked, not looking up. Thomas shook his head. Cotter slid a folded paper across the counter. It was old, worn, the kind you'd find nailed to a post and torn by wind. "Some folks out of Tularosa," Cotter said, "offering a reward. Said she was part of a raid 6 months ago. Army's not looking, but bounty boys are. Lot of noise from folks don't care what's true." Thomas stared at the paper. The drawing was crude, but the name wasn't. Nayeli. Below it, the word traitor. "She was a girl when that happened," Thomas said coldly. "Doesn't matter to them," Cotter said. "Truth's got a short memory. Hate doesn't." When Thomas rode back into the valley, he saw them before he reached the gate. 3 riders perched near the ridge, just shapes against the skyline. They didn't move, didn't wave, just watched, then turned and rode west. That night, Thomas didn't sleep. Neither did Nayeli. In the darkness, they sat with the windows open, watching the wind roll across the grass, their hands resting together on the table between them. They came the next afternoon, 4 men. Dust-covered, armed, and sure of themselves. They didn't approach like lawmen, they approached like men who thought justice meant what they said it meant. Thomas was feeding the horses when he heard the hooves. He stepped out slowly, rifle in hand, but not raised. The lead man wore a black duster and had a scar down his cheek that looked like it had never properly healed. "You Granger?" the man called. Thomas nodded. "We're looking for the Apache girl, Nayeli." "She ain't here," Thomas said, calm but clear. Scarman smirked. "See? I think she is." "You think wrong." One of the other men spat into the dirt. "We got a poster says otherwise." "Poster's a lie." "Maybe, but we get paid either way." Behind him, Nayeli stepped out of the house. Thomas turned, jaw clenched. "Get back inside." She shook her head. "They won't stop if I hide." Scarman's eyes lit up. "There she is." Thomas raised the rifle. None of the men moved. It was a test. A slow tension pulled tight between them. "You shoot one of us," Scarman said. "The others still take her." Thomas stepped forward. "You take another step, you die here." Then came the voice none of them expected. "Enough." Everyone turned. From the road behind the barn, a single rider approached, flanked by dust. Deputy Eli Carrington. His horse moved at a trot, and he stopped a few yards from the group. "Put your guns away," Carrington said. "This is not how the law works." Scarman sneered. "This is bounty work, not law." Carrington held up a folded paper. "Judge Holden issued a ruling this morning. Girl's name is clear. No charges, no warrants. Any man trying to detain her now is committing kidnapping." Scarman's hand hovered near his belt. "This ain't your jurisdiction." Carrington's voice dropped to a steel whisper. "Draw, and I'll make it mine." The men hesitated. Finally, Scarman cursed, turned his horse, and spit into the dirt. "Not worth the trouble," he muttered, and rode off. The others followed. When the dust settled, Carrington dismounted and approached Thomas. "You okay?" Thomas nodded. Carrington handed him the paper. "Keep that handy. Won't stop bullets, but it might stop cowards." He turned to Nayeli. "You deserve peace. Sorry it's taken this long." She nodded once. "Thank you." Carrington mounted and rode away. The silence afterward felt heavier than the standoff. Thomas turned to her. "You all right?" She nodded, then looked at him with something between relief and fire. She stepped closer. Her hand touched his chest, just over his heart. "I thought you'd die for me." "I would've." She stood on her toes and kissed him. Not like a thank you, not like a woman paying a debt, like someone who had made a decision and wasn't turning back. He kissed her back. The land was still, and the sky burned gold around them. Later, when they lay side by side in the hayloft above the barn, she ran her fingers along the calluses of his palm. "You never asked why I stayed," she whispered. He looked at her. "Didn't figure I had to." "I stayed because here, no one asked me to be less." He didn't speak, just pulled her close, and in the quiet, the world finally felt far enough away. The rain came soft and slow that spring, washing the dust from the grass and filling the low gullies with quiet silver streams. The sky hung heavy with the smell of wet cedar and sage, and the wind seemed gentler, like it had lost some of its edge. The world around the Granger ranch had shifted in ways too subtle for most men to notice, but Thomas Granger noticed. He felt it in his bones when he woke. He saw it in the way the porch creaked less in the morning, as if the wood was no longer groaning under the weight of silence. Most of all, he saw it in the way Nayeli looked at him now, open, unguarded, as though the part of her that had always stood just outside her own skin had finally stepped in and made peace with being there. They worked together like they'd been doing it for 20 years. She mended the garden fence while he sharpened tools under the shed. She taught him the names of plants he never thought had use, and he showed her how to read maps and ride by the stars. Some days passed without much conversation at all, just the sound of boots in grass and the breath of horses, and the creak of the old well rope as it brought up another bucket. But the silence wasn't hollow anymore. It held warmth, shared understanding. Word from town was quieter now, too. After Deputy Carrington had delivered Judge Holden's papers, the bounty men hadn't returned. The flyers stopped appearing. The townsfolk still talked. There'd always be some willing to fill their boredom with another man's business, but no one dared come up the hill anymore. If they did, they didn't stay long. A few even nodded politely now when Thomas passed through Whitetail Junction for supplies, though their eyes still lingered a little too long on Nayeli. He didn't care. Let them watch, let them guess. He was too old to apologize for happiness. One morning, just after dawn, Nayeli stood by the window in his bedroom, their bedroom now. The quilt hung loosely from her shoulders, and her hair was unbraided, falling like night down her back. She looked out at the fog rolling over the fields, arms crossed under the blanket, eyes calm. "You ever think about getting married?" she asked, not turning. Thomas blinked, still tying the drawstring on his trousers. "Used to," he said. "Didn't see the point after Claire." She nodded slowly. "But now." He walked to her, setting a hand gently on her waist. "Now I think about it every time I see you." She looked at him finally. "Then why haven't you asked?" He smiled. "Didn't think you'd say yes?" She reached up, resting her palm against the side of his face. "I'm saying it now." The wedding was quiet. No priest, no town gathering, no ceremony under God's eye. Just two people, a binding promise, and a sunrise that painted the world gold. They stood beneath the old cottonwood tree behind the ranch house, the same tree that had once watched over their first true conversation. The judge himself rode up with Carrington to make it official, though Thomas suspected they'd come more out of friendship than duty. Miriam Keene brought fresh bread and sewed a sash of ivory cloth for Nayeli to wear. A few neighbors stood at a distance, uncertain if they were witnessing something scandalous or sacred. Thomas didn't care which they thought it was. When the judge asked them to speak vows, Nayeli looked Thomas in the eye and said only one word: always. And somehow, that one word felt more binding than any sermon ever could. Years passed in the kind of way they often do on quiet land, measured not by clocks, but by seasons and births and fences that need mending. Thomas's hair grayed more, though there wasn't much left to gray. His joints grew stiff in the winter and slow to move in the rain. But he still worked the land every day he could, with Nayeli by his side, now with her hair streaked with strands of silver that she never tried to hide. They had a boy first, strong lungs, wide eyes, and fists that curled around Thomas's finger like he already knew the man who would carry him. They named him Elias, after the deputy who had shown up just in time. Then came a daughter, born in the soft quiet of late summer, with a scream that gave way to a laugh before she even opened her eyes. They named her Willa after Nayeli's mother. The house grew louder. Toys carved from cedar littered the floor. Laughter echoed down the hallway. Crayons found their way onto the walls, and muddy boots left little prints across the kitchen tile. Chickens had to be chased out of the house more than once. One summer, Thomas caught Elias riding bareback on the smallest pony, completely naked except for a hat too big for his head. Nayeli had laughed so hard she fell against the garden fence, tears rolling down her cheeks. And in those years, Thomas found something he thought he'd lost the day his first wife died. Not just love, but purpose. A reason to keep waking up. A reason to grow old. One afternoon, long after the children had gone down for their naps, Thomas sat on the porch, sharpening a small knife. Nayeli rocked slowly beside him, her fingers weaving a bracelet from horsehair and thread. He looked out at the land, the barn, the rows of corn, the pasture where 3 horses grazed lazily in the sun, and felt the kind of peace that couldn't be bought, couldn't be explained, only lived. "You ever think," he said slowly, "that the world turned itself inside out just so we'd find each other?" Nayeli didn't answer right away. She set down the bracelet, leaned over, and kissed his cheek. "I think we were meant to find each other when we were both ready to be found." He reached for her hand and held it tight. A storm rolled in that night, but it didn't wake the children. Thunder cracked like a whip over the hills, rain pounding the roof, wind slapping the shutters. Thomas stood at the window, watching the lightning dance over the fields. Nayeli came up behind him, wrapped her arms around his waist. "I used to fear storms," she whispered. He rested his hands over hers. And now? Now they just mean you'll be beside me when I wake up." He turned to her and smiled. And when the storm passed, when the winds faded and the sky cleared, the world felt new again. One day, many years later, Thomas sat at the edge of the field with a blanket draped over his shoulders. His hands were knotted with age, his spine curved like a bow, but his eyes were still sharp. He watched Elias work the plow, guiding the mule with firm, confident hands. Willa rode ahead on horseback, her black hair braided tight like her mother used to wear it. The sun was low in the sky, and the wind was cool on his skin. Nayeli sat beside him, her fingers curled around his. "We did good," she said. He nodded, blinking slowly. "Better than I ever thought I could again." She leaned her head on his shoulder. And in that moment, Thomas Granger knew something with more certainty than he'd ever known anything before. He wasn't a lonely man anymore. He hadn't been for a long, long time. And so, a lonely rancher who once thought his days of love were over found not just a partner, but a purpose. A family born from courage, patience, and the quiet power of choosing one another. In the wide and unforgiving lands of the frontier, their story became a testament that love can bloom even in the hardest soil, and that peace isn't always given. Sometimes, it's built hand in hand. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Love Chronicles for more powerful tales of resilience, romance, and redemption beneath the open skies. Ride with us through the frontier, where every love story is wild, real, and unforgettable.